Yes, so thanks so much to Ivana for inviting me and all of the organizing work that she did to put this together, and also Dominica did a lot of organizing of transportation and hotels, and also thanks to Yuri for the tech support. I'm going to talk about I want to begin with two opposed tendencies that dominate contemporary theory and activism, particularly theory and activism on the left, namely survivors and systems. The first inhabits social media, academia, and some activist networks. It is expressed through intense attachments to identity and appeals to intersectionality, safety, and self-care. The second thrives in aesthetic and conceptual venues as a post-humanist concern with geology, extinction, algorithms, hyperobjects, biosystems, and planetary exhaustion. So on the one side, we have survivors, those with nothing left to cling to but their identities, often identities forged through struggles to survive and attached to the pain and trauma of these struggles. And on the second, we have systems, processes operating at a scale so vast, so complex, that we can scarcely conceive them, much less impact them. These two tendencies correspond to neoliberal capitalism's dismantling of social institutions. Ever more people experience ever more uncertainty, insecurity, and instability. Time has run out for keeping global heating below 1.5 degrees, and governments are unwilling and unable to implement the measures necessary for a just transition. Decently paid jobs are hard to find, easy to lose. Most people can't count on long-term employment or expect that their health, housing, and retirement needs will be met. Young people can't count on anything at all. Unions are smaller and weaker. Schools and universities face tax cuts, cuts to faculty, pummeled by competition, debt, and the loss of the remnants of public and infrastructural support. Mental health crumbles. Neoliberal ideology glosses this situation as one where individuals have to meet where individuals have more choices, where individuals have more opportunities to exercise their personal responsibility, more freedom. Now, very few people buy this story anymore. The reality is of a kind of neo-feudalism where we feel ourselves trapped into producing for the benefit of tech lords and billionaires who extract fees from our every interaction. Carl Schmitt famously characterized liberalism as replacing politics with ethics and economics. Late neoliberalism, which looks really like neo-feudalism, has its own specific displacement of politics. The public sphere has fragmented into multiple private domains, from the phones and platforms through which we interact, to the widespread non-disclosure, non-compete, and arbitration contracts of privatized law that unravel the fiction of bourgeois justice. For most of us, in societies of servants, there is individualized self-cultivation, self-management, self-reliance, self-absorption, self-care, and at the same time, impersonal determining processes, circuits, and systems. So we have responsibilized individuals treated as loci of autonomous choices and decisions, and at the same time, we have individuals who are encountering forces that are utterly determining and outside our control. Instead of ethics and economics, neoliberalism's displacement of politics manifests in a neo-feudal opposition between survivors and systems. Survivors struggle to persist in conditions of unlivability, rather than to seize and transform these conditions. Systems and hyper-objects, often aesthetic objects or objects of a future aesthetics, something to view and diagram and predict or even mourn, these affect us, these determine us, but our space for determining them seems to be totally eclipsed. The opposition between survivors and systems reveals a left that has lost its capacity for political expression. Ontologically grounded, both tendencies render political struggle, the divisive struggle over common conditions on behalf of a common project and future, they make that unintelligible. In the place of politics, we have a fragmenting assertion of the particular being of unique survival and an obsession with the encroaching, unavoidable impossibility of survival. Politics is effaced in the impasse of individualized survivability under conditions of generalized non-survival or extinction. The array of contemporary pessimisms should be recognized as symptoms of this effacement. They all proceed from the conviction that political struggle is pointless, that fundamental change is impossible, that there is no alternative. I'm going to give some examples of this. Afro-pessimists see no alternative to hatred of the Black, which they place at the core of European modernity. Eco-pessimists urge us to accept the catastrophe of climate change. No one is going to save us, so our critical energy should be spent on learning how to die. The feminist version, gyno-pessimism, tells a similar story about misogyny. Hatred of women is offered up as the explanation for everything from domestic violence, campus rape, and sexual harassment to, in the U.S., Hillary Clinton's failure to win the presidency in 2016. Women are kept down, abused, and murdered because men hate them. Whether offered as social or political analysis, misogyny is the attribution of a feeling that covers over the absence of an explanation. Right, now, my slides have gone way too fast, despite I think let me go backwards a bit. Let me go. Yeah, let's go there. Okay. So, like, here's our feminist icon knot. Okay. So misogyny is the attribution of a feeling that covers over the absence of an explanation. An event or phenomenon is positioned as the effect of an aversion that is attributed to a group. The group is constituted as a group by virtue of the attribute, and the attribute is treated as a cause. Empirical evidence be damned. For example, violence against women is explained as evidence of misogyny. But statistically, men are more likely than women to be victims of violent crime, with rape as the notable exception. Men are more likely to be victims of offenses committed by men, and women are more likely to commit offenses against women than they are against men. If misogyny accounts for violence against women, then would we have to say it's misandry that accounts for violence against men? Or are these categories just too crude to tell us anything at all? Misogyny's analytical weakness does not diminish its contemporary popularity. It might even increase it. In the affective networks of communicative capitalism, outrage circulates more easily than critical analysis. Now we need my cancel culture. There we go. Moralism substitutes for explanation, which can take too long to read and digest. Being hated inspires ferocity, self-righteousness, cancel culture. I'm unfriending anyone who thinks violence against women is okay. So rather than telling us something about the haters, misogyny or any of these pessimisms is an inverted or reactive social diagnosis designed to create an identity among the hated. By diagnosing the primary political problem as an attitude, as an aversion that persists transhistorically and transculturally, the liberal feminist or gyno-feminist or gyno-pessimist assumes the inadequacy of politics from the start. Material struggles over the division of labor, property, and the wage are neglected, and the capitalist system is taken for granted as the basic economic condition of our lives. The lens of misogyny prevents us from seeing the broad history of women's political movement. It can't focus on women's engagement in anti-slavery, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist struggles, or on our victories. It fails to place contemporary defeats in the historical context of the defeat of unions, labor, the Soviet experiment, and the communist dream of an emancipatory, egalitarian society characterized by solidarity and comradeship. So now I've opened this lecture with an account of why moralism and ontology have replaced politics on the left, right? It's a lot easier, and it takes our background condition of capitalism for granted. So what do we need instead? Well, I'm going to give some examples from Organize, Fight, Win that tell us about Black women in and around the Communist Party of the United States in the first half of the 20th century. They provide guidance, right? Ways of theorizing, ways of organizing that are really refreshing today. Their work teaches lessons crucial for generating practical optimism that's necessary in our present political setting. Most important, out of their lessons they teach, right? It's very basic, but it's the number one lesson: organize. Join organizations, build organizations, combine organizations. From their work as founders of the Harlem branch of the Workers' Communist Party, from their work as early delegates to meetings of the Comintern, as organizers in the U.S. South, where interracial organizations were outlawed, to their work as trade unionists, as party leaders, these women understood that political struggle is collective struggle. The only way to combat unemployment, low wages, discrimination, Jim Crow, which was the U.S. apartheid system, FBI surveillance, prison, and lynching was through the united struggles of all workers. And they realized and emphasized that this unity has to be built and organized. Black communist women's universalist, organized, and action-oriented approach to forging mass collective power stands in stark contrast to contemporary concerns with identity and ontology. Rather than emphasizing separate axes of difference that they then attempt to bring together, these women recognized how the capitalist class incited race hatred and deployed sex stereotypes in order to fragment workers and maintain class power. Oriented toward building working class power, Black communist women's political writing avoids identity reductionism, right? It avoids the assumption that a particular confluence of identities objectively renders one of the most oppressed or one inherently radical, an assumption that is prevalent today. On the contrary, their speeches and articles reflect knowledge gained from workers' experience, theorize patterns of exploitation and oppression, and propose strategies for organization and agitation. Their goal was building collective power capable of winning the struggle for liberation, a universal goal shared by all the oppressed. So the examples I'm going to give from Organize, Fight, Win, which I co-edited with Charisse Burden-Stelly and which came out with Verso last year, will give us some examples of this writing from Black communist women. And the first theoretical idea I'm going to talk about from this is triple exploitation. In an article originally published in April 1936 in the Communist Party's magazine called Women Today, Louise Thompson Patterson offered a theory of Black women's triple exploitation as workers, as women, as Negroes. Titled Toward a Brighter Dawn, the article described the near-slavery conditions Black women encountered in the Depression-era United States, whether as sharecroppers in the U.S. South or as domestic day laborers in the Bronx. Their description orients a report on a meeting of the women's subsession of the National Negro Congress. Thompson Patterson's goal in Toward a Brighter Dawn is highlighting this Congress, right, this big meeting, and showing how, quote, the most exploited group in America has, quote, banded together for the fight for freedom and will win, end quote. So she doesn't stop with her description of exploitation, and she doesn't use the threefold nature of this exploitation to determine an identity. Her theory of triple exploitation is an analysis for building power, for connecting, not separating. It shows why organizing Black women is important for the labor movement. Thompson Patterson says that this National Negro Congress meeting was the first time many of the women had ever attended a Congress. The stories they told and the facts that they related were sad, yeah, but, she writes, there was a ring of confidence in each report, a confidence born in many instances right at the Congress, that it was possible to change these unbearable conditions. Negro women from all walks of life, unskilled and professional, Negro and white women, found themselves drawn together, found they liked being together, found there was hope for change in coming together, end quote. Triple exploitation names the systemic problems facing Black women and connects these problems to those facing all workers and women, problems that can be solved through organization and unity. Organizing Black women is necessary for the women's struggle, for the labor struggle, and for the struggle against white supremacy. The Congress that Louise Thompson Patterson was describing in this article, the Congress ended up passing a resolution with a program for organizing domestic workers into trade unions, for organizing housewives' leagues, for organizing professional women, and for joining the three groups together. Claudia Jones, let's go back to Claudia Jones, good. Claudia Jones amplifies and echoes Louise Thompson Patterson when she calls on communist men to combat male supremacy. Jones made this call in a speech given on International Women's Day in 1950. The speech was published in the Communist Party's leading theoretical journal. Jones writes, "Failure to recognize the special social disabilities of women under capitalism is one of the chief manifestations of male supremacy. These special forms of oppression particularly affect the working women, the farm women, and the triply oppressed Negro women, but in varying degrees. They help to determine the inferior status of women in all classes of society." End quote. So in contrast to those feminists who foreground division between women and men, and for whom race and gender outweigh class, Black communist women's theorization of triple exploitation and oppression was situated within analyses oriented toward building class struggles. Rather than modes of analysis illuminating a particular standpoint or aiming toward inclusion within the dominant system, they demonstrated why men needed to oppose male supremacy and why white workers needed to oppose white supremacy. The capitalist class uses division to maintain power and suppress wages. Unity is the way to fight back. So my first example of the ways that Black communist women were oriented toward organization and unity took up their theoretical contribution of the concepts of triple exploitation and oppression. My second example is going to highlight their resolute internationalism. Oh, that's backwards still, right? No, sorry. Right hands, very good. Their resolute internationalism. This appears in their approach to fascism and their emphasis on peace. Already in the 1930s, Black women in and around the Communist Party were deeply engaged in anti-fascist struggle. They were drawing connections between what was happening in Europe and the situation in the U.S. South. Louise Thompson Patterson, who I talked about just a bit ago, she traveled to Spain and raised money for the Negro Ambulance Fund for Republican Spain when she returned to the U.S. In 1936, Tyra Edwards visited Germany, critically observing Europe's descent into fascism. One of her German friends had been too afraid to bring her to his house. Anyone who dared to entertain foreigners, she wrote, was immediately suspected of being an internationalist. And to entertain a Negro, that was enough to put you in jail for 6 months, end quote. Tyra Edwards also went to the USSR. In contrast to the fascist relegation of women to, quote, childbearing, the church, and the kitchen, the Soviets treated women as people, and a feeling of absolute racial equality permeated the culture, says Tyra Edwards. Once the U.S. entered the war against German, Italian, and Japanese fascism, the international importance of the treatment of Black people in the U.S. South became obvious. Right? A country mobilized for democracy abroad could not afford to tolerate racist oppression at home. In a powerful speech delivered to the Southern Negro Youth Conference in 1942, Esther Cooper Jackson appealed to Black youth to take leadership in the struggle against lynching, police brutality, the poll tax, and other barriers to voting. Quote, "The continuation of discrimination against the Negro is threatening our nation's very survival and playing into the hands of the Axis forces," end quote. Within 4 years, Claudia Jones would argue that the main danger of fascism to the world comes from the most colossal imperialist forces, which are concentrated within the United States. The U.S. couldn't be the world's champion of peace and democracy when fascism was the program of its monopoly capitalism. Claudia Jones theorized the push of women back into the domestic sphere, which happened after the end of World War II. She theorized that as a fascist offensive. The Hitlerite ideology of Kinder, Küche, Kirche was being used to drive women out of industry, to deprive them of gains that they made during the war. The wartime nursery program was cut. Women were fired. Men were told that the return of women to the home would end male unemployment, which was a line that had been used by German finance capitalists to conceal the real source of workers' problems. Carlotta Bass, we just saw, she was the Progressive Party's candidate for vice president in 1952. So she was communist adjacent and investigated as being a communist, but may not have been an actual party member. It's hard to know. She emphasized, quote, that race superiority and the oppression of other peoples was at the core of fascism, and the U.S. was supporting this at home and abroad. In South Africa, Malaya, Indonesia, and the Middle East, the U.S. continued to support that kind of fascism, linking the struggle against lynching and racist terror at home with the freedom struggles of people everywhere. Bass declared, "We want peace, we shall have freedom." So now I'm in the third section of, again, the theoretical and political contributions of these Black communist women patterns. The line from the speech that Carlotta Bass gave when she accepted the vice presidential nomination lets me move into this emphasis on patterns, particularly patterns of oppression and resistance. So I've been arguing that the writing of Black women in and around the Communist Party in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, I think this provides crucial guidance for us today. Their theories of triple exploitation and triple oppression and their insistent internationalism were key elements in their building of mass movements. The goal of their analyses was unifying struggles against white supremacy, fascism, militarism, and capitalism, finding and emphasizing patterns of oppression and resistance, showing how different struggles were aspects of the same fight against an imperialist order, not separate fights with separate goals, was a method for them to reach their goal. I want to mention a piece that we have in the book by Islanda Good Robeson. I fixed these timings, but they're all messed up. Yeah, Islanda Good Robeson. Her piece was initially published in 1953 in a newspaper called Freedom, which her husband, Paul Robeson, founded with Louis Burnham. Describing common resistance to oppression, Islanda, who is called Essie, she writes, "The struggle of the African people in Kenya for the return of their land, the struggle of the African, Indian, and colored people in South Africa against segregation and discrimination, the struggle of the North African people in Tunisia and Morocco for control of their land, resources, and internal affairs, the struggle of the people of Indochina and Malaya for control of their natural wealth. All these are struggles closely related to the struggle of the Negro people here in these United States for truly representative government and full equality. And these struggles are essentially another part of the successful struggle of the peoples of India and of Indonesia for self-government and independence. Their victories are our victories." And to go a little further back in history, the successful struggle of the Chinese people under the warlords and of the Russian people under the Tsars for control of their land, resources, and government were and are part of the whole picture, and their victories are also our victories, end quote. Their victories are our victories. Islanda Robeson finds the same general pattern in the universal struggle by people everywhere for freedom. Everywhere, freedom fighters face jail, persecution, and violence. Everywhere, they are condemned as subversives. And still they fight. The pattern extends across the globe, back in history, and toward an emancipatory, egalitarian future. Now, Robeson's biographer, Barbara Ransby, says that, backwards again. Barbara Ransby says that Essie was a ubiquitous figure in international art circles during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. She was really politically engaged. She traveled to the Soviet Union, and her brothers, like other Black Americans at the time, migrated to the Soviet Union. Essie herself enrolled her son to go to school in Moscow. She also traveled in Republican Spain during the war against the fascists, toured multiple African countries, and in 1949 visited the People's Republic of China. The FBI kept an enormous file on her, speeches and articles, particularly those that praised the Chinese Communist Revolution. In one essay, Essie excoriated the flag-waving patriots more concerned with rooting out communists than with ending lynch law in the Jim Crow South. And she presented the enemies of Black people in America not as North Koreans, Chinese, Russians, or communists, but as those who defend force and violence, hatred and prejudice, discrimination, segregation, and terror. Anti-communism is on the side of colonialism, imperialism, and Jim Crow. Communism is on the side of self-determination, equality, and peace. So that's the premise and the conclusion and the demonstration of these Black communist women. I want to draw some lessons from us, or some more lessons, particularly around the importance of opposing anti-communism. When communism, because of its mobilization for economic redistribution, racial equality, and Black-white labor solidarity, when it is presented as antithetical to legitimate political struggle, when it is treated as totalitarian, anti-democratic, and criminal, Black activism becomes sedition. Hear the words of Dorothy Hunton. She was a member of the Black communist women's group, Sojourners for Truth and Justice. Her husband, William Alphaeus Hunton, was the executive director of the Council of African Affairs, which was an organization designated as subversive by the U.S. American Activities Committee, by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and William Hunton served 6 months in prison for refusing to hand over the names of the contributors to the Civil Rights Bail Fund, which was established to protect people who needed legal fees because they were being prosecuted as being communists. So her husband did jail time. She was under a heavy-duty investigation. So here's a passage that comes from her book about her husband. What's important about the book also is how it details all of the persecution of Black leaders during the McCarthy era of anti-communist persecution. Hunton writes, along with the intensified practice of establishing guilt by unsupported accusations and character assassination by alleged association, there grew steadily a pattern of linking the advocacy of full equality for Blacks and minorities with un-Americanism. Frequently, in examinations designed to test the loyalty of applicants for government positions, the question was asked whether they believed in equality of the white and Black races or entertained Blacks in their home. It was not unusual in many areas for those defending non-segregated housing to be branded as communists. Long ago, those who pleaded for low-cost housing had been called socialists. Anti-communism went hand in hand with racism in labeling Black left leaders as subversive, in indicting them, imprisoning them, and deporting them. Claudia Jones, who I showed us slides of and quoted earlier on, she was deported because after anti-communist persecution. So there are patterns here. The racist deployment of anti-communism in the U.S. did not end with the McCarthy era. As the hearings and show trials wound down, professional anti-communists went to the U.S. South to help organize against desegregation, right? To help try to maintain the apartheid race system. These professional anti-communists worked to spread the sense that to support civil rights was to support communism, that Black liberation was fundamentally anti-American. So they defended segregation by using anti-communism to give themselves moral legitimacy. So it was a false, incoherent legitimacy that relied on an inversion of victimization, where whites were the victims, not the Black people lynched, blocked from decently paid jobs, and denied the right to vote. The new victim status attached to whites was turned into its own weird kind of heroism. Instead of violators of constitutional rights, they were positioning themselves as patriots. Instead of fascists, they were martyrs to anti-communist resistance, entitled to respect and dignity. Anti-communism persists today. It persists as suppression of the knowledge of and continuities between anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist struggles. Instead of a site where the struggles were unified, communism is treated as an alien ideology. its role in the fight against white supremacy domestically and internationally is forgotten or suppressed. This suppression distorts our understanding of radical Black politics. It distorts our understanding of the politics of women's liberation, of the labor movement, and of anti-fascism. Anti-communism isn't just an empty right-wing gesture deployed to demonize opponents. It activates opposition to equality, collectivity, and the struggle to build and take power. Given the right-wing recognition of the underlying commonality of struggles against oppression, a commonality the right associates with Marxism and communism, it's counterintuitive, to say the least, that so much energy on the left has been expended disavowing this common legacy and history of struggle. We should recognize this disavowal as an effect of anti-communism and as a barrier to liberation. It's an effect of anti-communism when it is literally premised on the rejection of communism, as well as when its premises reinforce anti-communist attempts to deflect attention from the absolute necessity of organizing for power. And I won't go into that because things. All right. So, Black communist women's theorization of triple oppression, commitment to internationalism, and appreciation of the patterns of oppression and resistance gives us a kind of approach to organizing and practical optimism sorely needed today. Our analyses and our actions have to aim toward building and organizing the unified collective power necessary for replacing the capitalism we have with the communism we need.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Jodi, and thank you very much for your really inspiring, powerful, and really energizing lecture you just gave us. I'm very happy I can be here and have a dialogue with you at this wonderful event which Capital is holding here in Bratislava. So first of all, I was really thinking about the context we speak about, and I'm very happy that we can learn something positive from Black women in Communist Party in US, but still, as a person without a political affiliation, for me, there is this first feeling I felt important to express at this moment, that our collective memory, our experience with communism is so different from the US context. And even we do have our traumas within our society from the past, that today I really have an opportunity to challenge myself, which I really like. And when I thought at the beginning about the Black women and the lessons we can learn, and compared it to the Roma women joined who are active within politics in 20th century, I realized one thing, and I wanted to ask about, because as a Communist Party was in opposition in the US, while we here in former Czechoslovakia had a communist regime without a legal opposition, that for sure influenced the way Black women can articulate topics. So maybe if we can start from that point, and you've mentioned how important it was that they didn't stop with their triple oppression, and that they really didn't stop at their identities. This is something really, really inspirational here for us. So maybe the first question, when we think of the Communist Party in US in first half of 20th century, so was it a space without segregation as we know it from US at the time?
Wait, I don't need the mic, right? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Well, I love that question. So the Communist Party in the United States, and then from the end of it gets started roughly in 24, but it takes it a while to congeal. So by 28, 29. And so for the next 20 years or so, it was the largest interracial group working in the U.S. South. This was a big deal because interracial groups were outlawed.
Yeah.
And so for white people to be in collective settings with Black people was against the law. So they were operating, yes, as it was illegal, the organizing work that they're doing, and it was an interracial organization. The party put a lot of effort into organizing in the South. One, because the things that are going on in the South, lynching, and just the overall level of violence, in addition to the economic deprivation and denial of really basic rights. But that made it an important site for organizing. So in the U.S., did it mean that they had no racial problems? No, right? But it meant that they took really seriously the necessity of organizing Black workers and making sure that because you're not going to have a working class struggling in the United States that doesn't include Black workers, really, that doesn't include workers of all races. So that was crucial.
Yeah, I would say that the starting point for the difference, for comparison for me, would be the situation of Roma people at that time within the Czechoslovak context. Because before the World War II, most Roma lived in Slovakia in really agricultural areas, working for food, not for money, not for the wage. And most of them were actually women responsible for their children, for their families, for nutrition, for everything. And when 1948 came and the regime changed, and after the war, many Roma people from Slovak part of Czechoslovakia got a chance to move to Czech part to be really employed in new factories, in state-built factories. It was a huge difference and a huge change for the whole Roma society, because from the point when they were just, someone who is segregated, who works just for food, for white people, now they were comrades. They were working, they have white colleagues, they were paid by money, they have a better housing conditions. So from this social point of view, the situation for Roma rapidly changed to better. But at the same time, and I think this is interesting, the idea of the regime wasn't really emancipation. It wasn't about identity, about the possibility for Roma to really be emancipated. So during those times, like official name for Roma person was a person of a gypsy origin, which implied that the person supposed to be like programmatically assimilated. And the word Roma, which is a word from the Romani language, for a person with Roma ethnicity, was like a symbol of ethno-emancipation, and it was forbidden. So I would say this is like a difference, I feel, within the context we speak about and compare a bit. And I would say maybe why also here we are kind of stuck on identity, I would say. This is like our fight, to be recognized, to be called by the name we really have for ourselves. Don't be called gypsy anymore. And this is really interesting because the topic of a unity, which really Black women brought to the table and which really drove the movement, is something we don't have. And we spoke before that the unity is really something we lack within Roma community. My question now goes to the book you spoke about and you wrote. I was really impressed with the stories, with the level of data you have. How is it perceived now within current U.S. context? We know that communism was evil in past, but we have really radical Republicans now. So how the book was perceived and how is it now, for nowadays U.S. context? That's really something I'm interested personally in.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll say a little bit about the book and then answer it. So the book is an edited collection. I put it together with another scholar named Charisse Burden-Stelly. And it's got 44, 45 chapters, all from the writing. It's never been collected before, this writing of from these black women in and around the Communist Party, the first part of the 20th century. So it's never been collected, which tells us a lot about how knowledge is produced. It tells us about how, knowledge of what radical black politics looks like, what women's politics looks like, what the labor movement, if it tells us even like what the history of communism looks like. I mean, if you, a lot of times not a lot of times, always, the communism in the U.S. was presented as only the Soviet Union or China, but big imperial global powers that were the U.S.'s enemy all the way to the core. And anybody who is a communist must be under the control of Moscow. And the thing is that when you actually look at the history of the party, it's just not true. Instead, you've got like groups of, particularly the earliest years, they are housing organizers and teachers, and there's black women, guys who are part of like journalists, and I think interracial groups. But they're people who are worrying about things like, how do you have a meeting? How do you arrange a meeting? How can what does it mean to try to get people from here to there? They're worrying about really small things. They're not under the control of Moscow. They're not thinking about Moscow. They're thinking about New York City, or they're thinking about Chicago, or they're thinking about the conditions in the South. Like what's happening in Moscow, it's really not what's going on. But in general, the U.S. has been stuck in this vision of the central control of some evil empire. And one of the things that unites the two U.S. ruling class parties continues to unite them, is their anti-communism. And everybody loved Obama, and yet Obama was mentions things like terrorism, fascism, communism in the same sentence. So it's the situation is radically structurally different than in a country that had a ruling communist party.
I would say that the production of knowledge, that's something really interesting to speak about, because here in our context, we tend to speak about it as about the media reflection of the topics which are related to the Roma community, but it's also about the stories which are told, which is not just about distinction between men and women, which is now the topic, and more stories of active women are emerging, and more researchers are really coming into that. But when we go to Roma women, we are really at the very, very basic. So when we look at it from the point of view of gender-based history, we know that with our context, like former Czechoslovakia, we have a history of middle-class white women. And actually, this year we've started at the Roma Infinity Center in Prague with a topic about Roma women. And we get several feminists really to talk and historians to talk and find out that almost there is nothing. So at this moment, we can speak about 3 women, which stories I kind of described, each of them on a different level. First of them would be Elena Lacková, who I expect everyone here know who is that. It's the Romani writer. She wrote a book, I Was Born Under the Lucky Star. It's like the first book written really by Roma author. And she was actually very active within Communist Party. She was an educator also for the families, and the education she got helped her a lot. But that's like the famous person, the only one we know and we have biographies about.
Do you know if she's translated into English or not?
I would say it is. This book it is. Yes. I think it's like the most famous one. So
can I ask another question?
Yes.
And so she was a member of the Communist Party.
Yes.
And was the party supportive of her work? Was the work she was doing considered important party work?
I would say it was, but mainly there were these social aspects that she really worked with families, worked with women, and really worked on kind of socialization and maybe uprising the Roma community from the very poor conditions they were living in. So I would say this was mainly the case. And my question really went to the stories of women you were speaking about. How known are they within the US context, or what kind of legacy they have within the society when we get to the production of knowledge?
So I mean, the U.S. is enormous, and people are really people live in the present, which is just pop culture. So in general, but then if you go into the left, and then when you look at the left, then if you look at academic history, the weird thing is that there's been a really good academic history, particularly in Black communists, for the last 10, 15 years. But it doesn't seem like people hold on to it. It's just the books are there, but it's perpetually forgotten. So even though there's no good reason to forget, it doesn't take hold. That's one of the reasons that we're trying to bring this book out. So that's one thing. But there are groups that are trying to do this work to make the people better known. Claudia Jones is probably the best known on the left. She was because she deported. She's actually buried to the left of Karl Marx. That's a fact. And there's a great book, a biography of her called Left of Marx, or Left of Karl Marx, because that's where she's buried. She's well known. Lorraine Hansberry is a major playwright, and she's well known from the play. She's an award winner, A Raisin in the Sun. She died young, but she had so she was known as a culture figure, but her communist work was not well known. S.C. Robeson's husband, Paul Robeson, was globally famous in the 50s or 60s. He was lost. He was a singer. He sang all over the world, but his passport was taken by the State Department, which prevented him from earning a living. And so there was a massive campaign organized by the party in behalf of Paul Robeson. So S.C. Robeson was known in that she wrote a number of books and was known somewhat in that setting, but pretty much forgotten. So the keeping the memories and the contributions present has been really, really difficult.
Okay. I would say that for the Roma community and Roma activists, also within the European context, the Black Americans movement, and fight against segregation is something which is still very, very inspirational, I would say, and still very much living. I have to mention one thing, even though the idea and the ideology was really meant to assimilate Roma people and make them brown or white kind of. There were a short period of time when this changed, and it was after 60s, after the Prague Spring, really when I would say everything was more open. And during those times, in 1968, there was the Union of Gypsy Roma, both words were there. And that was historically the first time when Roma can really, within the Communist Party, create a policy, make decisions, and influence what's happening with the community. Unfortunately, that took only 4 years. And in 1974, because they were successful, the union was really cancelled. And what is really interesting is that there were always men figure in front of objectives and speaking, even though there were women working with them. And there is one struggle we have also now, and it is joined with aim for assimilation. And it's the fact that Roma women, because our culture there is a kind of an emptiness now, because we were really, I would say, big part of our community was actively and successfully assimilated, kind of, the integrated part. And Roma women are accused from emancipation. If you are emancipated, you go against our values, the value of the community, value of the history, what it is, it's patriarchy actually. So if you do something else, then you are the one who is responsible for vanishing our culture, which is very hard to fight. So can we compare that to US? It's last question, but it's really a constant fight for me and for other women in our personal lives. And it's really important for me to ask whether there is something inspirational for this?
Oh, I don't think I have an inspirational answer, unfortunately. I think that the differences are challenging and interesting. So part of it is the diversity within among Black people in the United States in the 20th century. So Claudia Jones was originally from Trinidad. A number of the organizers in the Harlem branch of the Communist Party were from the West Indies. And so in some ways, like, they're kind of claimed as part of a Caribbean culture and a diaspora culture. But that also meant that their background wasn't the same, say, as folks who had grown up with parents or grandparents who had been slaves and then who had left and gone to the U.S. North. So there were numbers of different people who the official U.S. society calls Black, but they're from really different backgrounds, and all of that diversity, I think, makes it so, like, to hold on to say there is this culture that you are holding on to or defending or trying to protect is it's just a really different story. Like, I was going to actually ask is. Because one of the criticisms, or just sort of a criticism, sort of a question is, well, okay, so your book looks at Black communist women. What was going on with Native Americans? And, I don't know, actually, that wasn't something that the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s was talking about. And so one of the things I wondered, is there any more overlap between the kind of experiences potentially of Roma people here and Native Americans, or is that also just so widely different it doesn't?
I would say there are some, I don't know if it's the right example to use, but the thing which was happening here to Roma women, and it was from the communist time, but it really stayed till 90s, was the forced sterilization, for example, of Roma women, and other aspects which really went to the core of the idea that there is something totally right with the race, with ethnicity of those people. So I would say that this is something which can be similar, but knowing that we had 3 minutes, I think I'm not able to find a better answer at this moment. Thank you very much for your wonderful speech and for the dialogue we can have. Thank you so much.